Hi, I'm MTG, and welcome to another Deck Tech Breakdown, where today we're going to be going over Lulu Loyal Hollyphant. But before we get started, I just want to do a quick plug on basically a new Commander series I've been trying to work on with my friends called Good Clean Commander, and it's a basically Commander focused playgroup on mid-power decks where we just, I don't know, have fun doing shenanigans and like casual play, but also playing like I don't know, effectively and smart to an extent. I guess optimize, I don't know. Less like silliness, but like also realizing it's a game and we're having fun. I don't know if that was a good description or not. But I did for the first video, Falco Spara Pack Weaver, which I did do a deck tech video on. It's actually the first video I did. So if you want to see what it does and kind of some of the things it can pull off in a game, go check out that video. But anyways, enough doing the old plug-a-roos and go into talking about Lulu. Um, so it was actually funny because Lulu, when I saw the Boulder Gates like spoilers and stuff, I actually got like really interested in this commander. One, because I think it, despite its like soulless looking eyes, it's kind of cute. So I was like, oh, this would be fun. But the other piece of it is one of my Twitter friends hit me up and was like, hey, I was interested in, maybe building this deck for my partner. So I was sitting there, I was like, I should just really throw together a deck list. And I sent it to them, just like seeing what they thought about it. And I don't know, it just kind of inspired me to, go forth and, I don't know, build this deck, if so to speak. So thank you, the Pokemon Prof, for again helping me like get inspired for this. But other than that, I think the piece of what like really drew my attention to this was just kind of the main core functionality of it, which is the at your instep. If a permanent you control left the battlefield this turn, put a +1/+1 counter on each tap creature you control, then untap them. So I love flicker effects. So like this commander just like goes, hey, put your favorite like Flickr ETB kind of things into this deck, and like I'll make sure all your other things grow big and strong. Uh, but when I see this ability, like the keyword if like when a permanent you controlled left the battlefield, that can mean a few things, right? It can mean like if something died, it left the battlefield, so maybe you want recursion effects. But I think where I just naturally like lean towards is like more of the flickering side of things. But what's really cool about this too is just the flexibility of like maybe the color identity that you want to be with through the choose your background effect. So if you're not familiar with backgrounds, backgrounds are a mechanic that was introduced in Baldur's Gate where it basically helps like the flexibility of like what commander identity you want to work with, because if you're drafting and you have like I don't know, like basically Lulu is the only commander you want to work with, but you don't have that many cards that would be good for like a mono white deck. You're like, I don't want to be stuck in just that color identity. Well, backgrounds are an enchantment that you can pair with your commander to spread out like whatever, commander identity color identities you're going for. So you could have access to black or blue or whatever color that you want to pair with your commander that would, expand the identity that you're looking for. So they mainly did this for the monocolored like legendary creatures, again with the intent to kind of make drafting a bit easier. But something that's really interesting about this is it kind of works like how a partner card would work. So let's say like you're going to cast one of your background effects. If someone destroys it, then it can go back to the command zone. But I think like where this kind of took a different path is with partner cards, from like at least some of the videos I watched, they were kind of explaining from a design perspective that it was really difficult for them to anticipate like all the different combinations because there are so many different type of partner commander cards that it led to just not like an infinite amount of combinations, but a lot that they just weren't really capable of like predicting. And so by having like these backgrounds, I think it limited like all the different possible like broken advantages that they might have not been able to anticipate with partners, but kind of made it easier to like anticipate those things with backgrounds because you're more limited in like what you can pair with, but also like the different possibilities with each commander. So I just thought that was like an interesting piece. But what I also really liked about backgrounds is like I have played D&D, and it's interesting to see like how they were able to bring like the background of like, the D&D world where that can have an influence on your character and like what your character can do in that world. So like I've talked myself out of situations because I had this dragonborn character with like a military background, and because of that like background I had like more credibility, and I was able to get like my group out of like some trouble that they got themselves into. So I think like kind of bringing that like, I don't know, story aspect into your commander and finding a way to like still make it feel like magic, but then introducing some of like the D&D aspects of it, I thought was just like super clever. So I don't know. But anyways, that's just like the little piece about the backgrounds there. So to the deck building itself, right? When you're looking at the like backgrounds that you might want to add, like, obviously, if you're doing this, you're not restricted to a limited format. You're in Commander. So you have a lot of options that you might want to go with. And I think, like, again, looking back at like when something leaves the battlefield, you can kind of focus on background effects that might have good, like, flickering, or like if something's dying, like an aristocrats type build that you might want to do. So, looking at black enchantments first for backgrounds is Agent of the Iron Throne. Commander creatures you control have whenever an artifact or a creature you control is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, each opponent loses 1 life, and it costs 3 to cast. So, I think for this, if you're trying to lean into like an aristocrats, like maybe death and taxes type build with like Orzhov, like black white, I think like this background could be really interesting as a way to, potentially have like an alternate win con, because if Lulu's putting counters on a lot of stuff, you might be able to win through like combat, but maybe you need just a little bit of like drain where if you can't win through combat because someone has like a lot of, bodies up that could stop it or block, or you just can't find a way to break through your opponent's defenses, well, having in some like drain effects, like, what this enchantment is doing, where okay, maybe you can attack but they can just block, 1 or 2 damage so they could stay alive. Well, then if you have a sack outlet and this, enchantment's out and you start sacking creatures, then you can just get that little bit of damage across the line and potentially win the game. So that enchantment I think could be really interesting to pair with Lulu, because again, they're both like caring about things essentially leaving the battlefield, and in this case, like this enchantment wants things to die. So uh, with that kind of perspective in mind, I guess. There's also the one where maybe you just want to win through straight up combat. So, Agent of the Shadow Thieves, it costs 2, and commander creatures you control have whenever this creature attacks a player, if no opponent has more life than that player, put a +1/+1 counter on this creature. It gains Death Touch and Indestructible until end of turn. So, with Lulu potentially putting counters on anything that's like tapped, right? Then that might mean like one of your win cons can be focused on like winning through commander damage. And if Lulu has flying, that means it's already going to be more challenging to block and stop. So if you add stuff like making it even bigger with additional +1/+1 counters, death touch, and indestructible, well, there's a high chance that people A are going to be struggling to block it anyways because it has flying. But even if it, they have a flyer that's very strong, okay, Lulu doesn't care. Now it's indestructible and has death touch. So I think like that could pair pretty well with Lulu again, because Lulu's already going to be tough to deal with just for having like the flying ability. Another one too that I thought was really interesting is Criminal Past. This one is a 3-drop, and commander creatures you own have Menace, and this creature gets +X/+O, where X is the number of creature cards in your graveyard. So kind of back to, like things dying, leaving the battlefield that way. If you're trying to fill your graveyard up, then this can be really powerful because it's adding like another evasion effect essentially to like what your commander is doing. So now it's flying and it has menace. Like that's going to be so tough to stop. And I think like too, if you have quite a few creatures in your graveyard, then again, you're going to be like making your commander not just tough to stop and block, but now it's going to be super big and there's a higher chance that you're going to win through commander damage. So I think like that would be a really interesting like, possibility to just go hit face with your little cute angel elephant. So now moving to a different color, blue. I think I'm a little hesitant to want to like build with blue because I have a Yorion deck that I had to put on retirement after a game went over like 3 hours because I didn't have like a solid way to close it out. Like I basically made it almost impossible to deal like combat damage to me, and I was able to keep the stuff like Sarah's emissary alive so that like I wasn't able to get like killed through combat damage. But it was hard because like I didn't have like any sort of real win cons because they had all been like exiled, and I don't like playing combos, and I didn't have like approach to the second sun in my deck or anything like that. So I literally won by my opponent just drawing their entire deck like after like 3+ hours. So I was like, I don't know if I want to really lean into too many Azorius builds anymore for the time being. But I think if you are going to lean into that route, like you might want to add in like more of a solid win con, like Approach of the Second Sun, if you don't want to do anything with like Thassa's Oracle. And I kind of consider Thassa's Oracle being more high power anyways. But anyways, this enchantment is called Candle Keep Sage, and what it is when a commander creatures you control have when this creature enters or leaves the battlefield, draw a card. So I think like this would be really cool for like if you're leaning into like a flicker effect, um, because white has a lot of different ways that you can flicker. That you can get a ton of card advantage from this, and maybe you can use that card advantage that you get from this enchantment to like somehow make your creatures bigger, or get to whatever your win con is sooner. Like kind of picture like Chasm Skulker being a really good ad for something like this because it'll get a +1/+1 counter every time you draw a card. But that was kind of like the only blue one that really stood out to me that I thought would be good with Lulu because you're already building your deck around like wanting things to like leave or enter the battlefield multiple times, either through like flicker effects or reanimation. That I just thought this would be like really interesting. But the background that I ended up like settling with was actually just sticking to mono white through Far Traveler. So commander creatures you own at the beginning of your end step, exile up to one target tap creature you control, then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. So basically, it's kind of like a teleportation circle, right? Like you're flickering something and you're gonna try to get those like nice additional ETB effects. So with that, I my deck list has Far Traveler as my background. And I was trying to think about like, okay, if I'm sticking with mono white, what are the different ways that I would want to try winning with Lulu? So the first one I was thinking of just straight up combat damage with my commander. Like winning, that's one of the ways I would try to win. So with Lulu, because Lulu has flying, I think it's going to be harder for people to just stop them as much. But also, like, let's say, like, people have a lot of dragons or some sort of other angel tribal deck that I'm going to, and they do have ways to stop Lulu. Well, I think, like, adding trample effects, like Shadow Spear, I think is going to be really key in this deck, especially for Lulu. Because if Lulu's getting like bigger and bigger through +1/+1 counters, then Shadow Spear can just help kind of get through like whatever chump blockers are going to be up. Another card that I think is going to be really interesting too is Paladin class, because when you level it all the way up to the third class, then you can boost the power of Lulu, but then also Lulu could get double strike. So there's potential that you could like one shot someone just with Lulu's like, double strike ability, and if they have enough +1/+1 counters on them. I think like one of my favorite ways though to win with white, especially through combat damage, is dropping a Chroma's Will, because if you like control your commander, it's basically keyword soup. Like you get protection from all colors, your creatures get double strike, you get life link, like and I think I said indestructible, I can't remember anymore, but you get like everything, and it's just like pretty much a good way to just take an opponent out. So I usually use that as like one of my closing cards of just almost like, I don't know if it's a good analogy, but like white crater hoof, right? Like it's just that card that you can drop and potentially win the game with, is just depending on like how much damage you have on the board. But I think the key part there is just like protection from all colors, so then like they can't block you. So I think that's a really, I don't know, good way to try to win with white. But the other piece too is like if I'm trying to win through combat damage, then white has a lot of ways to force people to put creatures into the battlefield tapped. And I think one of my favorite ways to do that is through an enchantment called Authority of the Consuls, because it's a one drop, so it's very nice in your starting hand, but it makes creatures your opponents control enter the battlefield tap, and when they do enter, you also gain one life. So I like that to kind of like counteract like drain effects too, because if someone's just like making a ton of tokens and trying to sack them and drain you for one, well, every time they're like making those creatures, you're gaining back the life that they're potentially making you lose through something like Blood Artist. I don't know. So I really like that, but then also it helps shut down like creatures that have like haste effects, right? So if they're entering tapped, doesn't matter if everything has haste, they're tapped, so it could potentially buy you a turn to like find an answer or board wipe, or your opponent to do something to help with the board state. So Authority of the Consuls and other sort of like creatures enter the battlefield tapped effects, I think they can slow down the game a little bit, but you're also just like protecting yourself, but also potentially like opening like your opponent's board so that you could swing in with creatures and hit them without having to worry about blockers. Um, and kind of along those lines too, for like something that can act like protection, but also is sort of like a game closer to let you just like break through the opponent's lines, is Sarah's Emissary. So when it enters the battlefield, you can choose a card type, and then you get protection from that chosen card type. I usually like to choose creatures because, again, like I think if a deck, for the most part, they're either going to win through like right combat damage or some sort of like combo effect, um, or something that is just going to like win outright. But I think like more often than not, I run across like decks that are just trying to win through like combat damage. So if you choose, protection from creatures, and you can keep Sarah's emissary alive and protected, then it's probably safe for you to just like constantly be swinging out with your creatures, but then those creatures won't, they can't be blocked because they have protection at that point from other creatures. So that's like another really good way just to get like a ton of damage through potentially, if you can keep Sarah alive, so that like you don't, drop Sarah and then it gets removed 2 seconds later. But that card can be a really nice like way to help close out a game as well. At least that's been my experience. I don't know. But if you don't want to try winning through like Lulu combat damage or commander damage, then you can try like looking at other effects that can kind of synergize with things leaving the battlefield. So let's say like Lulu gets removed too much and she's too expensive to cast again. Well, I think it's important to add like other cards in your deck that kind of has similar like abilities or feed off like those similar synergies. So Flaming Fist Officer, I believe, is a new card from the set as well. But whenever another creature you control leaves the battlefield, put a +1/+1 counter on Flaming Fist Officer. And she's a 2/2 and a 3 drop. And so I think, like, again, what I like about this is it still benefits from like what your deck is trying to do, but it doesn't depend on Lulu to get those benefits. So I think like again having like other creatures that can still try to get like whatever your like synergy is without having to depend on the commander is like really key. And then there's other creatures that I think too that like can just help enhance like Lulu's ability overall, which is like, and I'm probably going to pronounce this wrong, Lazel Valkith's Champion. It's a 3 drop as well. And if you would put one or more counters on a creature or planeswalker you control or on yourself, put that many +1/+1, or sorry, that many +1 of each of those kinds of counters on that permanent or player instead. Wow, that was a mouthful. But basically, you double whatever like counters you're putting on yourself, another creature, or a planeswalker. So that's pretty sweet because like if you have planeswalkers as well, now you're putting like additional loyalty counters on them. So there's a lot of really cool stuff with that like card in itself, and I think it would just synergize really, really well with Lulu. Another card that I haven't really seen much play with, and I don't know if it's just the circles that I've been playing with, but Sunscorch Regent. It costs 5. It's a dragon with flying, and whenever another opponent casts a spell, put a +1/+1 counter on Sunscorch Regent, and you gain 1 life. So I like this again because it's not depending on Lulu to get those +1/+1 counters. It just gets it from your opponents trying to play the game. So I really like cards that, I don't know if like the terminology here is correct, but kind of calling it like passive value, where you're not necessarily like feeding like mana into it to get those abilities to like do cool things. It's like when your opponent benefits, then you benefit too. And I think that's like really, really cool. So I'm curious like how, I don't know, Sunscorch Regent would perform in this deck. And again, I haven't really seen people play with it too much, but I think like the fact that again it doesn't have to depend on Lulu to get bigger is a really key piece. So kind of looking at like those abilities and those effects, essentially the win con overall would be build a board state up and then have some creatures where you are okay flickering, because if you do flicker creatures that have +1/+1 counters on them, those +1/+1 counters, fall off. They're no good. But if you have stuff like Spirited Companion or other creatures you don't necessarily care about, like flickering or having them not get beefed up with counters, then like you're still gonna have like that synergy going on the board. You just have to be careful you're not like losing counters on other things. But for example, like Spirited Companion, you flicker that, you're gonna get card draw, and you're not necessarily gonna be like swinging to win with your like 1/1 doggo, unless that's what you want to do. There's no problem with that. But white, I think in general, just has like so much value, especially over the last few years. We've been getting some like crazy cards, especially when it comes to like card draw and like like we all know about like Esper Sentinel and stuff, but like one of the new cards that I thought was just like super incredible and really interesting was Archivist of Ogma. So again, dropped with Baldur's Gate, and you probably heard some hype around it already. But I still just find it like really interesting because in my mind it's kind of like White's opposition agent, but it has flash, and then whenever an opponent searches their library, you gain 1 life and draw a card, and it only costs 2. So what I think is interesting about this too is like where opposition agent kind of shuts down someone who's tutoring, and can give that like feels bad moment. Like this is another example of like a white card that's just trying to scale with whatever your opponents are doing. So if you have someone who's like able to tutor a lot or fetch lands a lot, you're going to be benefiting a lot with this card. And again, like I think it's so interesting, like these effects that white has, where it's like, oh, you're gonna do like these crazy broken things. Well, I have cards that are gonna let me do those in one way or another, or like not necessarily tax you, but like let me benefit from you benefiting as well. And like I think other good examples of cards like that are like some of the new more like ramp effects as well, or like in Smuggler Share's case, like you can ramp or draw a card. That one dropped from like the new Capenna set, but how that one works is like at the beginning of each end step, draw a card for each um, opponent who drew 2 or more cards this turn, and then create a treasure token for each opponent who had 2 or more lands enter the battlefield under their control. So I find that like really interesting again, where you're benefiting when your opponents are benefiting. And another card that's good for like ramp, which dropped with this, you know, uh, Baldur's Gate set is Deep Gnome, uh, Terramancer. So it's flash, has flash as well. And whenever 1 or more lands enter the battlefield under an opponent's control without being played, you may search your library for a plains card and put onto the battlefield tap. So again, it's not saying basic, it's saying a plains card. So if you have something that has like the type, like the keyword type plains in it, and you want to go fetch that up, like, wow, that could be really good, especially if you're playing like multicolored decks. So I think that's super interesting. But overall, like white just has so much value and so many interesting ways of just kind of trying to balance the board out in your own favor. Again, like if you're playing with someone who's ramping like crazy, then you can potentially ramp along with them. Or if someone's drawing a ton of cards, you could potentially be like, cool, I'll draw a lot of cards too. So I think that's like interesting in a way that it's not making your opponents feel bad or like shutting down what they're doing. but it's also not necessarily letting them run away with the game too, because you're trying to, in a sense, scale with them. So, other effects in this deck that you could try to like implement as well, because if you're doing like flickering effects, is some cards let you do like recursion, like karmic guide, when it enters the battlefield. So, like I'm just imagining like, okay, like karmic guide gets something valuable out of your graveyard, and then you flicker that and it grabs something else that you want. And so it's just like, wow, when I think white, I'm not always like really thinking like, oh, look how many like recursion effects that it has. But then you have things also like Luminous Broodmoth, which when a creature that doesn't have flying dies, it enters the battlefield again with a flying counter on it. So imagine like someone using like a destroy effect or like a way to kill Adeline, and then instead Adeline comes back with like a flying counter and like bops you for even more damage because now like maybe you don't have ways to block like flying creatures. So I think there's just some like really interesting like recursion effects that white has, that could like really really help you benefit in this deck, because like it's just I don't know, I just love it so much. So going on like just other card draw effects that are so interesting too is, so we all know about Esper Sentinel. Did you pay the one? But like New Capenna got Rumor Gatherer, and it's an uncommon, so it's, I believe it's still pretty cheap. I don't see this card spiking in price personally, but with like a mono white deck, like sometimes it's like, what do they call it, white weenies or whatever, where you're just making tons of like little 1/1s or other creatures that you're just going to try to like pump up and swing out or something. This card would like kind of synergizes really well with those type of effects where you're just trying to create a lot of bodies and hit face. Because whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, scry one, and if it's the second time, this ability is resolved, draw a card. So, like, you play a creature, and let's say like Adeline, you play Adeline, and you get to scry, but then when Adeline like makes tokens later when she attacks, then those tokens entering the battlefield will also feed into this ability as well. So you're potentially either going to be scrying, or if you only had mana to cast one creature but you attack with Adeline and she makes the token, then you get to draw that card as well. So I think like there's just a lot of really cool effects that like, Rumor Gatherer can kind of synergize with and help you get card advantage. But going along to like another card that I came across recently, I think I was like looking at Scryfall or something, but Verge Rangers. And so people complain about like white not having like great ramp, I think, but it's kind of confused me a bit because I feel like ramp has like isn't necessarily like a huge issue for white. But I think Verge Rangers is like one of those cards that I'm kind of surprised I don't see people playing a lot with either, because I think it could potentially be a really good ramp card, especially if you're, playing with like a landfall deck. But it's a 3-drop, has first strike, and you may look at the top card of your library at any time. So that in of itself, I think, is a really powerful ability, because if you look at it, it's kind of card advantage because now you know what's on top of your library, and you could try planning accordingly for that. And then the other piece of this is, as long as an opponent controls more lands than you may play lands from the top of your library. And I think that's really helpful too, because like if you're one now knowing what's at the top of your library at any moment, and then you can, potentially play lands off the top, that means when it's your upkeep, like you can anticipate like, oh, I'm gonna hit my land drop, or you're able to like take a peek and be like, oh, next time I draw a card, I don't want it to be a land, so I'm going to play this off the top of my library, and then maybe whatever underneath that, like you can do something else with. So I think it's just helpful because you're getting a lot of additional information, but then you're potentially like ramping on top of that by playing lands off the top of your library. So cool card. And like let's say you're not getting any sort of ramp effect off of this, but it has first strike and it's a 3/3. So this could become a potentially a really big threat later on, like as Lulu's potentially putting like +1/+1 counters on all the creatures that are tapped. So then this has like first strike as well. So like a 4/4 with first strike, a 5/5 with first strike, like those, that's going to be a threat. So even if you don't get like necessarily the ramp abilities from it, you're still going to have like a really solid body to work with. Um, but outside of just looking at like the cool like flickering effects that you can do, you also have like really cool ways that you can just protect like your creatures and your board state um, through just like flicker effects as well. So like Eerie Interlude, I think, is a really cool example of like how you can use like a flicker effect to protect your board state because it works at instant speed and you can exile any number of target creatures you control. Return those cards to the battlefield under their owner's control at the beginning of the next end step. So let's say like someone's trying to deadly rollick something, you can just flicker it and then keep it protected. Same with like Ephemerate. So Ephemerate costs only one. It also works at instant speed, and you can exile target creature you control, then return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. So I think like those kind of like, dodge effects essentially are really cool because now it's like working with your commander, it's working with other effects that you might have on the board, but then you're also like keeping the stuff protected. And I don't think I need to bring up like Teferi's protection either. Phasing out like that is just wow, it's amazing. Can win you the game. But other like flicker abilities you might want to add as well are things like Chiming Prince or Flicker Wisp, because those are just bodies slash also flicker things. But I think like my favorite one is probably Teleportation Circle because it's an enchantment. It is 4 cost, but like you're still guaranteed like some sort of flicker effect at the, every turn that you have it out. So, anyways, sorry if this was too long of a video. I think it's just a lot of really cool ways that you could take this deck and a lot of like really fun effects that I love, especially about mono white. Um, but yeah, let me know if you are, playing this commander and how it's been for you, or if you have any card recommendations. I would absolutely love to hear them. And thank you for hanging out. Have a good one.